Привіт! Це подкаст «Коли все має значення». Мене звати Ангеліна Карякіна, а зі мною тут...
Наталка Гуменюк. Вже тут.
Наталка вже тут, але це ненадовго. Але в нас є можливість поговорити про гостей, які Наталка, як завжди, знайшла десь в іншій точці світу, які мають абсолютно унікальну перспективу на те, що зараз відбувається в цій частині світу. Ми говоримо про суперзірку іспаномовну американської журналістики Хорхе Рамоса, ведучого, журналіста. Наталко, по-перше, де ти його зустріла, 2 слова? А по-друге, тут вже небагато питань стосовно чому ви вирішили говорити, дивлячись на все, що зараз відбувається з приходом до влади президента Трампа.
Хорхе Рамос – це журналіст мексиканського походження, який останні 40 років живе в Майамі, звідти вів 39 років програму на Univision. Це така мережа іспаномовна для латиноамериканців, іспаномовних людей, які живуть в Сполучених Штатах, і є отим головним ведучим головного телешоу, коли щось ставалося в Латинській Америці, він там їхав інтерв'ювати, не знаю, Уго Чавеса, кого завгодно. Я мала нагоду бути на гей-фестивалі. Фестиваль «Гей-фестивал» – це в Картагені. Це один з найбільших світових літературних фестивалів, який засновано було в Британії, але він має подорожуючі такі міста, і є латиноамериканська версія фестивалю в Картагені, де я мала змогу цього року виступати. Це великий літературний фестиваль думок в тому числі. Я якраз мала нагоду бути на панельній дискусії з Хорхе Рамосом. Якраз в неділю після цієї розмови, звісно, схопилася за нього перед його відльотом в Майамі, щоб він пояснив все про тарифи, Мексику, Панаму. Ми розуміємо і що, і Трампа, звісно.
Настрої, напевно, і у Хорхе, і взагалі в Америці насторожені, якщо, не знаю, не сказати якесь інше слово, не підібрати, звісно, що там це наші суб'єктивні погляди звідси з України, але скажи, будь ласка, в якому настрої Хорхе, яке в нього бачення майбутнього, наскільки все апокаліптично виглядає?
Треба додати, що в Хорхе настрої саме апокаліптичні. По-перше, я думаю, що нам мало зрозуміло, наскільки все-таки Латинська Америка і Сполучені Штати є частиною Америки спільною. Це вже давно країна, де іспанська мова друга, де кількість людей, які мають латиноамериканське походження, просто гігантська. Ці країни і континенти, вони набагато більше інтегровані, ніж, скажімо, ми з Європейським Союзом. Зараз є величезний острах, люди бояться, тому що їх будуть там без причини, можливо, висилати, може бути дуже велика турбулентність з одного боку. З іншого боку, він говорить про те, що країни настільки інтегровані, що там, щоб там не говорили про вплив Китаю, чого завгодно, це неможливо. Це вже неможливо розірвати. Єдине, що там ситуація, яка існує зараз, вона якби шкодить всім, тому що я хочу ще додати таку річ, я мала нагоду ж бути у Мексиці цієї осені. І, зокрема, у місті Монтеррей, в штаті Монтеррей, це штат на півночі Мексики, близько на кордоні з Техасом, який має валовий продукт більше, ніж там вся Україна. Це один з якщо взяти цей штат, чому? Тому що там фактично зосереджене одне з найбільших автовиробництв і взагалі виробництво всього, що потім потрапляє в Америку. Тобто більшість японських компаній, корейських компаній, Toyota, Hyundai, хто завгодно, мають заводи. Сполучені Штати вже давно виробляють дуже мало всього. І насправді останні десятиліття більшість всього, що потрапляє в Америку, виробляється в цьому прикордонному штаті Мексики. Вони дуже багаті. Мексика там за якимись показниками, один з найбільших експортерів Сполучені Штати, тому йдеться про дуже великі гроші, які ми собі, чесно кажучи, не можемо уявити. І що таке мита? І взагалі, звідки взялася ця історія? Це трошки важливо, можливо, пояснити. Століття тому в Америці колись люди не зовсім платили багато податків. До Першої світової війни американська економіка фінансувалася за рахунок мит. І от зараз питання, хто сказав Трампу, що так можна повернутися на століття назад. Мита – це означає, що просто продукти, які будуть ввозитися в Сполучені Штати, будуть дорожчими. І тут питання. Це може бути або ці компанії просто здорожчують ціни і будуть платити за це більше американські покупці, або компанії мають зменшити вартість своїх продуктів, і компанії будуть, втратять частину прибутку і будуть оплачувати це мито. Чи, наприклад, американські компанії-імпортери будуть платити це мито. Але, в принципі, не може такого бути, щоб продукти, машини, все що завгодно, від нафти до газу, щоб вони стали дешевшими для американського покупця. Тому все здорожчує для американського покупця. Можливо, це колись в якійсь перспективі змусить інвесторів взяти і відкривати заводи, не знаю, Hyundai і Toyota в Сполучених Штатах, але це дуже важко уявити, тому що там дорого. Тому все це виглядає дуже дивним, таким складним, але загалом, і взагалі там причина, через яку оголосили ці тарифи, вона з цим не пов'язана, але турбулентність величезна. Ми просто до кінця не уявляємо, тобто скільки грошей від цього всього залежить. Ясно, що якісь будуть там попередні рішення, і Америка не завоює Панаму, і Панамський канал. Але це точно зросте популярність такого націоналізму в Латинській Америці, де лідери, скажімо, непопулярні. На цій хвилі, вони звучать добре, вони захищають гідність своєї країни, вони не люблять бути приниженими. Так, от це все якось запрацює, тобто створить якусь зовсім іншу динаміку, але, власне, чого люди дуже сильно бояться, це реально цих примусових виселок сотень тисяч людей, де є там причини говорити, досвід показує, що ніхто особливо не буде розбиратись. Тому настрої такі, але... Чесно кажучи, нам залишається в чомусь за цим спостерігати.
А на що залишається сподіватися? Дивись, ми бачимо, що все-таки американська демократія так чи інакше, і особливо під час першої каденції Трампа, все одно пручається. Так? Дуже багато речей блокуються через суди, попри більшість в Конгресі, але є надія і на законодавців. На що сподівається Хорхе?
Знаєш, я коли була з ним на дискусії, він розказав дуже гарну історію про те, як він брав інтерв'ю у Уго Чавеса, і де той йому пообіцяв, що Венесуела стане найдемократичнішою країною в світі, що там преса буде дуже вільною, будуть права такі-то в опозиції, і буде те-то. Да? І через якийсь час він це сказав, що неможливо. І більш того, мені це якось дуже запам'яталося, бо ми це упустили, ми якось живемо, наше покоління живе в часі, коли в Венесуелі завжди був якийсь авторитарний лідер. А це була дуже стала з демократії. Да, можливо, там олігархічна, але демократія. Він каже, ти виявляєш, в 98-му році, коли я там був, всі венесуельці казали, демократію зламати неможливо. В нашій країні не станеться. Ми будемо поставати, в нас двопартійна система. На той час багато латиноамериканських країн були такими авторитарними, ще Мексика не була, скажімо, демократичною, в них не було вільних виборів, а в Венесуелі були. На жаль, нема такої речі, як точка неповоротя. Він багато розповідав, коли він брав інтерв'ю у більшості президентів, лідерів, коли він говорив з Даніелем Ортегою, нікарагуанським диктатором сьогодні, коли той також обіцяв якісь інші речі і такою людиною не був. Тому мені тут радше саме досвід Хорхе більше показує якийсь такий песимістичний сценарій. З іншого боку, оскільки він з Майамі, він добре знає Марко Рубіо, чинного держсекретаря. Він, власне, говорить про його опортунізм, але, власне, показує, що те, що говорить Рубіо зараз, взагалі ніде ніяк не є частиною того, що він говорив раніше. Тобто це не частина політики, це ситуативні заяви, ситуативні речі, що дає нагоду нам думати, що, а може, сьогодні він говорить таке, зміниться кон'юнктура, і він буде говорити інше. Тобто тут хіба, сподівання на те, що оскільки це нічого не означає, тобто це якась частина способу залякування, тиску, способу ведення політики, це може змінитися після того, як якісь речі можуть бути неуспішними, аніж просто якась ідеологічна річ.
Бачиш, наш гість першого випуску і твій хороший друг, професор Тімоті Снайдер, можливо, недослівно я його процитую, але саме він каже про те, що демократія може бути втрачена, те, що називається overnight, за одну ніч, і що це може відбуватися дуже-дуже непомітно. Руйнування інституцій – один з пунктів в його книжці «Уроки тиранії». Власне, на це і варто звернути увагу. Немає речей, які неможливо змінити. Цікава думка. Що, давайте слухати. Розмова, яку Наталка привезла аж з Колумбії, з одним з найпопулярніших іспаномовних журналістів в Сполучених Штатах і в Латинській Америці Хорхе Рамосом.
I know you're such a person for this continent, but for Ukraine it's a bit too far. And we know little, but I really start with the basic. We do not understand what is so big with these tariff things. What it means for Mexico, how it's seen, and what is the whole thing with tariff of Mexico and Canada are.
So let me tell you a little bit of what I do and what I've been doing. For the last 38 years, I've been doing a newscast in the United States at a company called Univision. What's interesting is that we broadcast in Spanish for the Latin American audience in the United States. So we are more than 65 million Latinos, and we are very interested in what's happening in Latin America. So whenever there's a crisis in Latin America, in Colombia, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, people flee and they go to the United States. I would even say that Florida and Miami is part of Latin America more than part of the United States. So we follow news in Latin America, and when you stop a Latino or a Latin American right now, everybody is asking you, ¿qué piensas de Trump? What do you think about Trump? Trump is the major factor right now. And in the last few hours, as a matter of fact, in the last few days, we have seen a new Trump. He says that he doesn't want war, but what we are seeing is that a Trump that is expanding, a Trump that suddenly wants the Panama Canal, a Trump that is imposing tariffs, a 25% tax on Mexican products, 25% tax on Canadian products, 10% tax on Chinese products. And suddenly what's happening, we are going from a tradition of soft power to hard power. I don't mean militarily, but he's imposing the force and the strength of the United States on the rest of the world. And that's where we are right now. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I would say that as of February 1st, it's a new era. It is not January 20th when he took power for the inauguration, but February 1st with imposing tariffs and taxes is a new era for Latin America and probably for the rest of the world.
Why they would do that? So what kind of good it brings to the U.S.? It just can ruin the economy. But what is the explanation why you would impose all of a sudden tariffs? Is it like you need to fill your budget or?
Well, no, I think it's a punishment. It is the sense that Donald Trump can do whatever he wants. And even though it's going to affect the American economy, it's such a strong economy that tariffs on Canadian products, Mexican products, and even Chinese products, Americans are going to feel it, but it's not going to crush them. While the economies in Latin America and Panama, Colombia, Mexico, they could really feel the impact of those tariffs. Why is he doing it? Hard to understand. I mean, I don't want to get into Trump's head, but what he is saying is that he's making Canada and Mexico and China responsible for the overdose cases in the United States. I'll give you an example. In the last few years, every year, about 19,000 Americans have died of overdose in the United States, mostly because of fentanyl. And Trump is blaming mostly Mexico, but also Canada and China, for being responsible for those deaths. Because of that, and because of the millions of immigrants that have crossed from Mexico to the United States, he's imposing these tariffs. The consequences are terrible, especially because it is not a problem in which Mexico is the only one responsible, but it is also because of the drug use in the United States, because of all these overdose cases are related mostly to the United States and the culture in the United States, not only because of drug traffickers in Mexico.
But would I also understand that, for instance, today, it's not about just drug cartels. It's also like chemical producers in China of the fentanyl, which kind of passing through Mexico. But it's really like more also inner American problem, the U.S. problem, the whole issue with the overdose. Yeah.
So where's the problem? We're in Colombia. We're doing this interview in Colombia. And about a decade ago, maybe a little bit more than that, it was exactly the same debate. Who is responsible for drug trafficking? Is it the drug traffickers who are creating heroin and cocaine in Colombia, or those drug users in the United States? Who is responsible? Actually, both are responsible. And the way in which Colombia and the United States back then, not with Trump, back then dealt with the problem was, let's fight together drug traffickers and let's fight together drug consumption in the United States. So that was about a decade ago. Now it's the same issue. Who is responsible for those dying of overdose in the United States? Partly because of the culture in the United States, and of course, partly because of drug cartels in Mexico. But how are you going to fight that? Trump thinks that the way to do it is imposing tariffs on Mexico so that Mexican authorities will react to that and do something about it. It is highly improbable that that's going to work. It is almost impossible for that because the Mexican government does not have the capacity to control areas of their own territory against drug cartels. They can do something. There's a state called Sinaloa, which is close to the American border. The Mexican government cannot control what's happening in Sinaloa right now. There are areas in the south, in a state called Chiapas, and another one called Tabasco, in which the government cannot control what's happening in those territories. So can the Mexican government do something? Yes, they can do something. They can impose a little more authority and order in those areas. But the reality is that there are many areas of Colombia and many areas of Latin America and many areas of Mexico in which the governments have no presence and no authority.
The moment I arrived to Colombia, it was the moment when we landed, opened our news Twitter, and there was this Twitter fight between Colombian President Petro and the Donald Trump on the Americans wanted to send the immigrants back. The president didn't allow the plan to land, despite he promised before. But later, he backed down. But the next day, I was staying with my Colombian political journalist friends. They all said it was like the worst day in their life, worst within a recent period of time. But they said something very interesting. They said, like, Trump will be gone and will be overtaken by the Chinese. What is paradoxical in this way, what Trump does, he often says, I want to kick out China from Latin America, where the Beijing is coming. But it looks like the other way, because what people say then, like Colombians may say, like, wow, we can't trust these people. They humiliate us. Better do it with Chinese.
That could be a possibility, but the link between Latin America and the U.S. is so strong that I don't think the Chinese simply just can take over all the economy, all the imports that they are receiving from the United States. The relationship is incredibly strong. So China could have a bigger influence, but they cannot take over of what the U.S. has been doing here. What we saw with Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, is that he had the courage, I think. I know Petro is very unpopular, but I think he had the courage to denounce the way Colombian immigrants were treated when they were deported from the United States to Colombia. They came here in chain. For hours and hours, they couldn't go to the bathroom. And they were treated like criminals. Because for Donald Trump, the about 14 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, they are criminals simply because they came illegally into the United States. But for the rest of the world, they don't have a criminal record. They simply left Colombia and left Mexico and left Central America and left Venezuela because they were being either persecuted and they were trying to get away from poverty, from violence, from lack of opportunities. So for Donald Trump, they are criminals. For the rest of the world, they're just citizens who are looking for a better life.
I know it's such a broad topic, but for us, it's hard to challenge, especially Ukrainians, the migration from the rest of Latin America through Mexico and what's happening on the border. But I give you the example. Ukrainians needed to meet a couple of the Republican and even MAGA politicians. And I, like when I had a chance to interview them and talk, the way they speak, oh, you're speaking about the Russian invasion, but we are invaded. You're speaking about that, but they use this terminology of a really clearly like foreign invasion with the army and trying to say, we have this invasion of the immigrants. I was reporting the elections this year in the US, being quite a lot at first, like in the north, Pennsylvania, Michigan, but later going to Phoenix and Las Vegas. But also, even in New York, I heard these voices. I've been to the Trump rallies. I've seen, these pictures with Venezuelans. People were literally saying, it has never been before. The hotels are inaccessible in New York because Biden administration put the immigrants into the hotels, It was really the debate. So is it something really happening because of the conflict that there are higher, amount of the immigrants coming from Guatemala, from other places to Haiti, to the U.S.? How you think the whole issue with the border, with migration can be sorted out? Because also the Democrats also couldn't really do much, to be honest.
I think the explanation is quite simpler. The pandemic. After the pandemic, we saw a rebound of the economy in the United States in ways in which no other country in the world has seen. It was really, really important the way it happened. But the rebound of the economy was not happening in Latin America. So immediately after the pandemic, we saw a new wave of immigrants coming from the south to the north. And that's the normal way. I mean, you go from southern countries to the north. You go from vulnerable countries, poor countries, to countries that are richer and feel safer. And that's exactly what we have seen. Before the pandemic, there were about 10 to 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. Now we're talking about 14 million undocumented immigrants. And those who came into the United States legally asking for asylum. So what you are seeing truly is people who are desperate, who are fleeing persecution, in the case of Mexico and Venezuela, who are fleeing violence, and who are simply looking for better opportunities. I'm an immigrant in the United States, so who am I to criticize a father who wants a better life for his daughter or for his son? Exactly, how can you criticize them for doing that? You cannot do that. So that's exactly what we are seeing. And in the United States for Donald Trump, they are criminals. And when you put such a broad label to all these people, it is impossible just to have a positive outcome. So it's a new era. Now we can say it's the era of Trump. I think in about 15, 20 years from now, we're going to be asking, what did you do in those days? And as journalists, I think we have the obligation not to remain silent.
But you're based in Miami. In like my previous episode of the podcast, I talked to European intellectuals, Ivan Krastev, who really also tried to explain to the Europeans that the U.S. current administration, like and generation of the politicians, they have a different view on Europe, because previously it was all the immigrants, people who came from Europe after the Second World War or fought during the Second World War. Now it's very much Latin America, and he was saying that like the political elite comes from Miami, comes from Florida, and like people. So what would you say on that? Also on the people like Mike Rubio, who is the new Secretary of State. First of all, what is this new foreign policy? So at the same time, it's like the people coming from the region.
Yeah.
You know, it's more Latin America central, because even when I'm here, I understand like how more connected Latin America and the US are. It's really like, it's a continent. It's America. So what is this change in the policy?
Well, what's happening right now is that Latin America has become a much more important area. Why? For Donald Trump, simply because millions of immigrants are coming to the United States from Latin America, millions of them. And his main promise during the campaign, it was mass deportations and making sure that he was going to control the border. So that's why for Donald Trump, it means a lot to be able to control migration from the south to the north. That's the only thing. Something interesting happened with Venezuela. Donald Trump sent an envoy to Caracas. And then many Venezuelans, the majority of Venezuelans voted for Donald Trump in the United States. And they thought it was going to be easier to get rid of Nicolás Maduro, the dictator of Venezuela, once Donald Trump was in power. But guess what? That isn't happening. He's negotiating with the dictatorship in Venezuela in exchange for allowing flights coming from the United States to Venezuela. Not only that, bring back the Venezuelans from the United States to Venezuela on one hand. And on the other, thousands and thousands of Venezuelans who depended on a special immigration permit to be living in the United States are losing that in the next few days. So it is not exactly what Donald Trump had promised. Donald Trump is simply unpredictable. It is impossible to know exactly what he wants, except for the fact that he is doing it only as a transaction. He's a transactional person. He's doing everything that could benefit him, and that's about it.
But can you tell more a bit, Mike Rubio? You know, who is this? Do you know him?
I know him. I've talked to him on many occasions. Marco Rubio used to be a Miami politician. He's from a Cuban-American family. He speaks Spanish fluently. I've spoken to him in Spanish on many occasions. He was a senator from Florida. And then he had a fight, an open fight, when the first time Donald Trump wanted to become president. A truly personal fight in which Donald Trump was offending his family. He was calling Marco Rubio names. And at the end, power was very much more important. And then Marco Rubio became an ally of Donald Trump. And now he's the Secretary of State. And Marco Rubio, what is he doing the first time he's doing? He's going to Latin America before going to Europe, before going to Canada, as was the tradition. And that's one of the reasons why everybody is really concerned. Is Marco Rubio going to be defending Latin American interests? Absolutely not. He's going to, as we speak, he's in Panama, but most likely he's going to send exactly the same message that Donald Trump wanted, which is the Panama Canal is an American property because we're talking about properties right now, and Trump wants it back. Of course, it's not true. The Panama Canal is from Panama. Nothing has to change that. But the question is, this expansionist Donald Trump, how far is he going to go? I mean, he's been attacking Canada, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Panama. He wants Greenland back. So even though he's saying that he doesn't want war, what we are seeing truly a very different expansion is Donald Trump.
Can you also explain what is the real story about Panama Canal? Yes, it is important for trade. Trump, kind of freaking out that, there are Chinese control over that. But can you really explaining the significance of Panama? What is so much about that?
Yeah, of course, with Panama, trade around the world depends on the Panama Canal. Panama has many ports. 2 of those ports on both sides of the Panama Canal are controlled by the Chinese. That's the way it works. So many Chinese ships come through that 2 of the ports are controlled by China. It doesn't mean that the Panama Canal is controlled by Chinese. It simply means that those ports are managed by China. Donald Trump doesn't want that. He wants to make sure that China does not own or manage those 2 ports, and that's the excuse for trying to get back the Panama Canal. Panamanians don't want that. I don't think there's going to be a war. I mean, so far, this hard power of the United States hasn't been manifested, but the threat of stronger action is always there. Diplomacy is not going to be enough. So I wonder who's telling Donald Trump that he has to get the Panama Canal back. Some of those people that were visiting him in Mar-a-Lago are just putting ideas in his mind, because Panama was not even part of the campaign during the last election. How is Donald Trump going to get control of the Panama Canal if Panama is a sovereign country and will not allow the U.S. to get back the Panama Canal? So I think we're starting a very difficult period in the history of U.S.-Latin American relations.
But I think there is no way not to explain that, because indeed the number of the Latino voters who voted for Donald Trump has risen, from 30% to 45%, but also Florida votes for Trump.
Florida is not New York. Florida is not Chicago. Florida is not California, where the majority of voters in those 3 states, for instance, tend to vote Democratic. And historically, for decades, Latinos used to vote more for Democrats than for Republicans. And then a few years ago came a President George W. Bush and his advisor, Karl Rove, and they believed that it was possible to divide the Hispanic vote. George W. Bush almost made it with 44% of the Hispanic vote. And now Donald Trump is back again. The real question is, if you are being attacked by Donald Trump, if you are being offended by Donald Trump, would you vote for him? 8 years ago, the answer was no. I will never vote for Donald Trump from many voters. But nowadays, that didn't matter. And almost 45%, almost 50% of the Hispanic vote went to Donald Trump. Why? I think the only explanation is that for them, when Donald Trump was attacking immigrants, they were thinking, no, he's not attacking me. He's not attacking my family. He's attacking somebody else on one hand. And on the other is the perception or the conviction that their life is going to be much better with Donald Trump than without him. Economically, they're thinking, I might get a better job. I might get a better salary. I'm going to be able to afford a house that I couldn't afford that. And then the economic argument was much, much stronger than the immigration argument. And that's why they voted for Donald Trump.
I had a very weird experience in one of the rallies with Donald Trump in Pennsylvania. And I was sitting literally with a couple from China. They were from China. They went for their curiosity. He was bashing China, but they didn't care. I was looking at them and said, what do you say on that? And he said, that's campaign. I'm like, he's speaking about China. You are from Shanghai. They were saying that it's not about us. He's saying something just for campaign.
And then, again, thinking, my family is going to do better. And also is the hope of belonging, of being part of the United States, of being part of that United States that is taking control, that is in power. And also, I think Donald Trump is a reaction to a country that in 2045, everyone is going to be a minority. In other words, diversity is ruling right now. Demography is ruling. In just a few years, everyone is going to be a minority. And I think Donald Trump represents a movement, an idea that you have to resist that diversity in the United States. It doesn't matter. Demography is going to, at the end, is going to rule. And by 2045, white, non-Latino inhabitants of the United States is going to become another minority. So that's something that Donald Trump and his followers, they simply don't want. When they say, make America great again, they're thinking of a white America.
And I still don't understand why then people like Marco Rubio, are into that. Why it's not visible and clear?
Well, he's representing a Trump administration. I mean, I've spoken with Marco Rubio on many occasions, and he never once said the Panama Canal should go back to the United States. Never, ever. It would have been impossible for him and for many other Latino politicians to say something like that. And then suddenly he's representing and defending an impossible idea, something like that.
Because for us, it's more there is a strong sentiment among the Cuban immigrants against the communism. So kind of they're very supportive on Ukraine, not into Russia. They have still that, but we feel like it's not any longer, working. As you explained Venezuela, as you explained Cuba.
So for Ukrainians, do they believe that Trump is going to be good for them? In other words, that he's going to defend Ukraine against Russia?
It's complicated. What Ukrainians, as everybody else, are looking for some signs that something is hopeful. So they think at least we knew Rubio for quite some time. And at least, one thing what Elon Musk is saying, another thing what is Donald Jr. Trump is saying, but Rubio was always very critical on Russia. Let's hold into this kind of thin line, which maybe may preserve us. So I would rather say that. Yeah. Because you would understand, because where he's coming from, his, anti-communist sentiments, and also the tradition. So he couldn't truly break up. So I would say that he's just looking for signs.
Are you hopeful?
I'm generally hopeful, but I don't think we're in a better position than we were half a year ago.
I was in Ukraine at the beginning of the war. I was very impressed. I didn't meet a single Ukrainian who didn't tell me that they were going to win. Everyone was telling me, yes, we are going to win. And they were completely convinced that Ukraine was going to win in the war. I wonder if that has changed, if that sentiment has changed.
I should say that people still think we'll prevail. It's not victory, but we'll prevail. We'll get out of this.
We'll lose part of the territory?
Wherever, but we'll kind of find our way out. Yeah. And it doesn't depends that much on the Ukrainians, because they're more looking that we see the objective reality, the U.S. won't be backing us to that extent. So it's rather about objective reality, not what we can do. People would rather say, if we have enough of that, we could win, but very conditional. But tell me, so when were you were you once or were you a few times?
I was only once at the beginning, and it was impossible even to reach Kyiv. It was just a few kilometers within Ukraine. Parts of the country were blocked by your own citizens, making sure that Russian troops couldn't get in. I saw someone taught me on how to stop a Russian tank. And then they were using Molotov cocktails and showing me how with beer bottles they were going to confront Russia. It was a very hopeful moment, even though the Russians were already in your territory. They were completely convinced that at the end, Russia was going to lose the war.
Can you tell also a bit about your story with Trump, your story with this administration and where it brings you now?
It happened in 2015 when he decided that he wanted to be president of the United States. And he was in those golden escalator announcing that he wanted to go to the White House. In that first moment, he said that Mexican immigrants, and I'm a Mexican immigrant, that we were criminals and rapists. That's exactly what he said. And of course, we're not. And he was, right at the beginning of his campaign, attacking immigrants right from the beginning because he clearly thought that it would pay off, and he was right. I sent him a letter to Trump Tower asking him for an interview. And instead of giving me the interview, he published that letter on Instagram with my telephone number on it. And I got hundreds and hundreds of phone calls, people threatening me, others who, funny enough, who were asking for a job, others who wanted just to become singers and wanted me just to put them in contact with the network where I was working. So it was a really interesting experience. Nevertheless, he didn't give me the interview. So I followed him to Dubuque, Iowa. And in Dubuque, Iowa, just a few months later, I was able to go to a press conference. There was a moment of silence, a pause. I stood up and I started asking him about questions on what he had said about Mexican immigrants, about the wall that he wanted to build, about the mass deportation that he had promised. He didn't like my questions. He said I wasn't called to ask a question. I mean, I'm a journalist in the United States with the First Amendment, with freedom of the press. I just didn't have to wait for him to give me permission to ask questions. So he called his bodyguard and he threw me out of that press conference. So what I was saying is that here there was a man who wanted to become president of the United States and who was a threat to the freedom of expression, who was anti-immigrant, and people were not seeing that. And they were saying, "Oh, Jorge, no, you're wrong. You don't know Donald Trump. You don't know the United States. He will never be president." And that's Trump being Trump. So one of the first signs of alert, I was sending it to the rest of the country. Look what's happening right here. So people don't know that I was able to go back to the press conference because Trump and his team, they realized they had made a mistake, and I was able to question him for about 10 to 15 minutes. He won that election. Later on, he lost the 2020 election, and I was able to talk to him again at the press conference, and I asked him, when are you going to recognize that you lost the 2020 election? He turned around, he said, we won, and then he left. In other words, he has never recognized that he lost the 2020 election, and I think he's a danger to democracy. And it is hard to understand how someone like him is back in power. And I think we'll never forget that. It was a decision that is changing history, not only in the United States, but also in the rest of the world.
As a Ukrainian as well, you met kind of most of the leaders of this continent for all your interviews, including like the people from Chavez to Daniel Ortega. And like for quite some time, okay, there was a Soviet Union sentiment, all these type of things. But now it is like a clear cooperation of Russia with Venezuela, like absolute like backing and very close cooperation of Nicaragua with Russia and in Cuba. What is that? What is actually really happening? What really Russia gives them? It's not about the sentiment of the past. Are they really dependent? By the way, what is their view maybe after Syria? After like Russians were kicked out of Syria and like Putin just given up on them.
It's support and it's a message to the United States. I mean, if you keep on attacking us, if you keep on threatening us, we have the support of Russia. They simply feel that they can withstand Trump's attacks or the United States attacks if they're supported by someone stronger like Russia. So democracy doesn't matter to them. What's important is to stay in power regardless of the attacks from the United States. And Russia is part of that.
It's also a bit about Mexico, but it's also about the, Colombia. Both governments, the country you are from and the country we are in, the governments are not supporting Ukraine. Kind of also on the public statements, there is a void. With AMLO, it was different. Now Claudia Sheinbaum is kind of like just is silent. It's better than to be openly pro-Russian. And we're trying to do that. And people sometimes see them as pro-Russian. I don't think they are. I think that they're just not supporting Ukraine. They have their own fight with the US, with everything. But it's very hard for us to assess also the reasons why they're popular. What is the right way to speak about that? The dynamic on the continent of these new leaders.
They do represent the majority of the people for the first time. For many, for the first time. Mexico was not a democracy for 71 years. There were 3 presidents who, again, did not represent the majority of the people. And then López Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum do represent the majority of the people, or at least that's what they claim. That's a big change. Pedro, in the case of Colombia, is exactly the same. Colombia has been ruled by parties that many people believe were not representing the majority. And now he can claim, that, at least that's what he says, that he's representing the majority of the people. But I wonder, in Latin America, who is supporting Ukraine?
It's odd. Chile and now Argentina. And with Javier Milei.
How about El Salvador?
Not clear. I think Ukrainians are cautious about Salvador also because it's also a very controversial president who's super popular, use violence, but stop the crime.
So Argentina and Chile are supporting Ukraine?
Yes. It's more complex because there is Lula, which play kind of more BRICS story with China and something, but try to play kind of neutrality. So we know that the people in Brazil are kind of very clearly, they're not pro-Russian. Also, but it's usually now they have the governments and the politicians also on the left who are, like speaking that way. There would be, so it's really complex, but I also want as a Ukrainian that we are not lost because sometimes you just can't kind of claim that like we don't like Pedro because he really says sometimes nonsense on Ukraine.
Pay attention to what's happening in Latin America in the next few months because of the attacks from the Trump administration, the attacks on Brazil, Colombia, Panama, Mexico. There's a nationalist movement in all those countries. The traditional pro-American stance might change because of the attacks from Donald Trump. That doesn't mean that they're going to turn to Russia or to China But it means that this traditional pro-American position is going to be shifting a little bit. It's going to be changing. That could have an effect, obviously, on what's happening in Ukraine.